Okay, so let's keep going with the Tempest Act 2, Scene 1. The vague description is that it's just another part of the island, separate though from where Ferdinand, Miranda, Prospero, Caliban are. And then there's another group that we'll get to in the next scene. But in this scene, we're dealing with a lot of different characters, and it's just, again, really important to have the arrangement straight in your mind. And I again kind of make mistakes sometimes. But let's start with Alonso, probably listed first because he's the king. Sebastian is Alonso's brother. Antonio, we know, is a bad guy because he's the one that took the dukedom from Prospero. Sebastian and Antonio seem to get along pretty well, and we'll see that they get up to no good here in a few minutes. Gonzalo is, again, a good guy. Remember, he was the one that helped Prospero and Miranda safely make their way to the island with enough supplies to get by. This was back several years ago. So Gonzalo and Alonso are kind of paired up. Sebastian and Antonio are paired up in contrast to Alonso and Gonzalo. So Alonso, he's got a little bit of guilt on his hands. Gonzalo is genuinely a good guy, but Sebastian and Antonio are clearly kind of bad, evil-ish. Adrian and Francisco, these are just two nobles who were along for the ride and had attended the wedding in Tunis. And so the main thing that's going on here is Alonso's grief and the way that Gonzalo, Adrian, and Francisco are trying to comfort, soothsay Alonso. And this provokes a reaction with Sebastian and Antonio, who are kind of on the aside making fun of Alonso and Gonzalo in particular. They're kind of like having this sidebar conversation going on, and there's some comedy there, and they are sort of bad guys, but they're pretty funny as bad guys can be. And the last thing I'll say about what we have going on here is remember that Prospero is engineering a series of events that are taking place on the island, beginning with the shipwreck. Okay, so there's this theme of plotting, planning, manipulating. There's also a theme having to do with who has power, and it seems like the one who has power is the one who takes it by whatever means necessary, legal or illegal. So we've seen Antonio, or we've heard about it in the exposition, we've heard about how Antonio seized power from Prospero. We're going to see Antonio and Sebastian coming up with a plot to try to overthrow Alonso. We'll get to that shortly here in a second. So let's be in the shoes, so to speak, of these characters, and probably this would hold true with the class in general. Let's say we all found ourselves in someplace strange and foreign, maybe you shipwrecked or what have you. There might be some of you that are going to be sort of, put out, inconvenienced, disparaging of the situation, and maybe rightly so. I mean, not everybody wants to be shipwrecked. But a more optimistic personality is going to look around and think, oh, wow, this is great. Well, at least we're not in school. Oh, this is cool. Check this out over here. Look what I found. Hey, this is going to be an adventure. So there's two ways to look at a given situation. And Shakespeare, being such a connoisseur of human character, is going to really highlight two ways of looking at being shipwrecked on the island. Gonzalo represents one side. He's very optimistic about the potential that the island might have. And Sebastian and Antonio just think the island is this is pretty crappy, and yeah, what's the point of trying to live here? So anyway, the thing I want to bring out then as um, the island, the beauty of the island is in the eye of the beholder. So think about that for a minute. And when we see let's see. Gonzalo starts to muse about the potential of such an island. He said, "Here is everything advantageous to life." And then Antonio very sarcastically says, "True, save means to live," meaning, it may have everything, but there doesn't have enough to keep you alive. And then Sebastian agrees of that there's none or little. And then Gonzalo's seemingly oblivious to the shade being thrown by Antonio and Sebastian. He goes on to say, "How lush and lusty the grass looks, how green." And then Antonio says, "Well, the ground indeed is tawny," saying it's sort of brown being sort of less appealing than green, less life to it. Anyway, so they kind of, everything Gonzalo says, they have some sort of rejoinder, making fun of him. It's not an unfamiliar thing these days for the one who's optimistic in a room of a couple of pessimists is going to end up being the butt of the joke. So again, Shakespeare, quite a connoisseur of human character, but Gonzalo is pretty stalwart in his optimism. And he says, hey, look, somehow our clothes, which were wet from the sea, they appear new and fresh rather than stained by the salt water. Etc. We'll come back to Gonzalo's optimism in just a moment. All right, so again, one of the primary conflicts going on this side of the island is Alonso's grief for the loss of Ferdinand, whom he thinks is probably dead. He's pretty down in the dumps. And he says, "My son is lost," and he's also married off his daughter in Tunis. And so, he has neither a son nor a daughter anymore. And then Francisco, one of the lords, who's good-hearted, not to be aligned with Sebastian or Antonio, he says, "Sir, he might live. I saw him beat the surges under him and ride upon their backs. He trod the water, whose enmity he flung aside. He breasted the surge, most swollen that met him. His bold head above the contentious waves he kept, and oared himself with his good arms in lusty stroke to the shore, that o'er his wave-worn basis bowed, that stooping to relieve him, I not doubt he came alive to land. No, he's gone." So there's Alonso's mourning, there's the sniping wit of Antonio and Sebastian, and Gonzalo's optimism comes to the forefront again here. In a really interesting speech, he says, he imagines what it would be like if they formed a new society on the island. He says, "In the Commonwealth, I would by contraries execute all things." So the Commonwealth being the sort of social setup on this potentially new island society that he's imagining. And what we have here is an early exploration of this idea of a utopia. Back in the day, in Shakespeare's time, this was quite a fresh and new idea, inspired by, guess what? The discovery of the New World, the Americas, and all of the opportunities, all the resources that they began to find in their seafaring expeditions and the colonies that were getting established. And so Gonzalo, I think, is a mouthpiece for this idea, and maybe the birth of the American dream might be contained here, and this idea that he has about a new society, a chance to redo things. There's maybe a little element of communism in this snippet of speech, and I will also point out that some scholars might argue that The Tempest might be the first work of American literature, because perhaps Shakespeare had in mind as a source one of these islands off the coast of the Americas. Perhaps The Tempest is set on the other side of the Atlantic. We don't know for sure, but it's an interesting thought. And there certainly are themes about all the potentials of the New World. So Gonzalo says, no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate, letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service, none. Contract, succession, born bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil, no occupation, all men idle, all, and women too, but innocent and pure, no sovereignty. He's kind of got this idea that if the island provides sustenance, then people don't have to do anything. This idea of the noble savage, that all things being equal, all resources provided for, people can live in a state of peace and harmony, and not have to work so hard. Sort of like a Garden of Eden type of fantasy. And of course, Sebastian and Antonio quickly make fun of Gonzalo's idea. But it's interesting to note how Shakespeare works this utopian theme into Gonzalo's speech. And Gonzalo certainly is the character to voice such a philosophy. So it might help to imagine there's a crystal ball, or there's some means by which Prospero is able to spy on this side of the island and what's going on. And right around this section here, we see Ariel show up, and Ariel's always up to something on behalf of Prospero's grand scheme. And so Ariel plays some music, solemn music, makes everybody get sleepy and tired. And then, so Alonso says, I wish mine eyes would with themselves shut up my thoughts. I find they are inclined to do so. And so Alonso falls asleep. And then Sebastian and Antonio start talking. Antonio's like, listen, I took my dukedom from my brother. Why don't you take the kingdom from your brother? He's asleep. We're on this island. There's no more Ferdinand. There's no more Claribel. You're next in line to the throne. All you gotta do is kill the guy. It's not that big a deal. People do it all the time. And so Sebastian gets worked up and he says, let's see. Let me find the line here. So Antonio's, plan convinces Sebastian to, maybe he'll go through with it. So thy case, my dear friend, shall be my precedent, as in the way that you took your dukedom and obtained Milan. I shall come by Naples. Draw thy sword. One stroke shall free thee from the tribute which thou payest, and I, the king, shall love thee. Draw it together, and when I rear my hand, do you the like to fall it on Gonzalo. So Sebastian's saying, if you kill Alonso, I'll kill Gonzalo, and you won't have to pay me tribute when I become king. So it's a win-win for everybody. But right then, Ariel comes in, wakes up Gonzalo, and Gonzalo takes his sword and says, hey, what's going on? Preserve the king. And then Sebastian and Antonio pretend like nothing happened. So in Prospero's grand scheme, he can't have Alonso being killed. He's got other ideas, and so Ariel steps in and and keeps the plot moving, and they decide to go in search of